So, Sarah, what are the top myths that men and women both have that are making a negative impact on their understanding of men's sexual desire and in their relationships?
Yeah. So in my book, I kind of lay out about 10 myths that negatively impact our relationships and, these negative ideas we have about men's sexual desire. But I would say some of the biggest negative myths that we have are one, that men don't need to feel desired. This idea that men chase and don't need to be chased in return. The idea that not only is men's desire high, constant, that men are always in the mood, but the idea that men's desire should be higher than women's sexual desire in all cases. And this idea that because we think that men's desire is surface level, that men are easy to turn on, that they are just looking for a physical outlet or sexual pleasure, that when they initiate sex and their woman partner isn't in the mood, that sexual rejection shouldn't hurt because all they lost out on was sex. But what they really lost out on was a chance to connect emotionally and be vulnerably available with their partner.
You're listening to Get Your Marriage On, the fun and spicy podcast bringing you new tools and fresh ideas so that you can be the sexiest couple you know.
Like many other men, I've probably said to my wife maybe once or twice, I'm always in the mood for sex, or whenever you want it, baby, I'm ready. Just kidding. I've probably said something like that hundreds of times. As a man, my sex drive is expected to be high, constant, and surface level. I'm being a little sarcastic there. But I know that there are exceptions to always being in the mood. In fact, when I'm really honest, there are many times I'm not in the mood. And my wife is even more puzzled when she's in the mood and I'm not. Because as men, we're socialized to think that we should have the higher sexual desire in long-term marriages. There have been many times in our marriage where the stereotype has gotten in the way, such as where men's sexual desire is simple compared to the complexity of women's sexual desire. For example, when my wife turns her husband down for sex, she thinks it doesn't hurt because it's okay for women to decline sex. But when she gets vulnerable and initiates and he turns her down, she's far more devastated. The stereotypical masculine approach to sexual desire is working against heterosexual couples' intimate relationships, and it's getting in the way of good sex. Today's guest is Dr. Sarah Hunter Murray, a sex researcher and therapist who has studied male sexual desire. I've read her book, Not Always in the Mood, and I look forward to sharing this interview with you. Dr. Sarah Hunter Murray, thank you for being here on the Get Your Marriage On podcast. How are you today?
I am good, thank you. And thank you so much for listening. Very happy to be here.
Great. So you are a PhD sex researcher. That's got to be the most fascinating field of study I can imagine. So you're there in school, you're surrounded by other fellow students, and all you do is learn about sex all day and talk about sex all day. But I think you've told me you had this one conversation with a colleague one day that changed everything. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. So like you said, studying human sexuality in my master's and for PhD, we get to ask all the questions that everyone is thinking, right? We get to ask participants, what is your experience with sex? Is this really true? And then of course, to generate these questions, we're always talking amongst ourselves and trying to kind of, make sense of the world, sexuality and intimate relationships. So one day I was talking with a colleague the way that we always do, and she just kind of mentions to me that she was at a dinner party with her husband. And the guys are kind of talking, and he says something like, oh yeah, anytime she wants sex, like I am down. Like I love having sex, never not in the mood. And just kind of, doing this kind of bravado, bragging type thing. And she didn't want to call it out at the time, but she was just telling me, she's like, but I was thinking, I was like, that's not true. Like just last week I suggested like we have sex or I kind of initiated it. And he said, no, he was too tired. What's up with that? And I just remember kind of laughing and being like, oh, men sometimes, just kind of, just laughing it off. But my wheels just kept turning. And I just thought that was so fascinating. This idea of how men sometimes describe their desire, or these assumptions about men's desire just being high, constant, unwavering. And this idea of it being celebrated, like, yeah, I'm always in the mood. And then this little question that kind of went against that said, always? And just kind of talking to this, women colleague, I was just like, you're onto something there. Like, I want to find out, was that just a one-off or is this more of a pattern? Can more people kind of relate? So that's why I just dug into this research. I was like, I need to dedicate my PhD to understanding men's sexual desire and like moving away from some of these, broad stroke ideas about it being high, unwavering, to men are just always ready to go, and talk to men directly and say, what's actually happening? Like, how do you truly experience sexual desire?
Right. Because men's sexual desire is probably a lot more complex than we men like jokingly say. Like there's this, meme on the internet. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have seen it where they say women's sexual desire. And it's like this 747 switchboard with like hundreds of switches and toggles and lights and
Yes,
everything. And then men's sexual desire. And there's just one switch, the
exactly.
one light. But,
Exactly.
but that's our cultural narrative. It's not accurate, is it?
It's not, and I'm glad you brought up that image because I've seen it, and I've even used it in some presentations that I've used because I think it's just such a
Uh-huh.
perfect visual representation of assumptions that we make, and I think they're actually, it's humorous, but it's also wrong, and in fact, I think it can actually negatively affect ourselves and our relationships if we really believe those things to be true. The thing that's interesting,
Right.
talking
Right.
about, my background in studying sexuality, I started by studying women's sexual desire. And the reason for that is that there was, as you were kind of suggesting there, this understanding that women's desire is complex, elusive. We have like this idea that women's desire can be kind of lower or maybe kind of more difficult to, experience at times, or we don't really think of women with high levels of sexual desire. It's like, oh, we need to kind of set the mood and have this nice, date night and connection and all this emotional romance. And I'm not saying that's not true in some cases or for some women, but we were kind of giving all the attention to that. And the assumption was we don't really need to talk about men. We don't really need to study men because the assumption was, like you were saying, it's just this on off switch. Sex is available with a partner that's interested, and men are default going to say yes. But what I've
Hmm.
through my research is that that is so far from being the truth. And as soon as there is some question,
Hmm.
space for men to talk about sexual desire, there's actually a lot more going on. What I'll say before we go kind of into like some of the myths and findings from my research is there are going to be men who say, you know what, I do really have a high sex drive, and actually it doesn't take much for me to get turned on. And to those men, I say, as long as that's working for you, that sounds great, no problem. But what I think
Right.
is that there's
Uh-huh.
just a lot of men who say that's not quite my experience, or like maybe that's my experience at some times, but not others. Or especially as, we
Hmm.
age, sometimes people will say, yeah, like in my teens and 20s, maybe I was like that, but now I'm 30, 40, 50, 60. I've got kids. I'm in a long term relationship. I got bills that got to get paid. Like life is not so simple. And sexual desire as a result is not so simple either.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I'm kind of in that demographic that you talk about. I
Mhm.
just turned 40. I have 6 children. I'm an
Mhm.
entrepreneur. My wife homeschools.
Okay.
So that's just a recipe for stress and
Yeah.
disorder and chaos, right? And there have been times I've kind of mourned the loss of my s- super spontaneous
Mhm.
horniness, I guess you could say, thinking, what's wrong with me?
Right. Right.
And anyway,
And we spend so
there's a
much
lot
time
more going
thinking.
on. Uh-huh.
Yeah, exactly. And what you're describing is so
Uh-huh.
common, right? This idea that we kind of describe men's sexual desire from that, like, high hormones, teenager, young 20s, not as many responsibilities typically. And we use that as some gold
Hmm.
standard, but we live most of our life outside of that time. And it's very normal and natural for a desire to ebb and flow. And I think that's why it's so important to talk about what does desire look like, say, even after 30, after parenthood,
Right.
some of these other things start coming into the picture because we live a lot of life in that time frame. And it can be hard to say, well, it's no longer like that, the teens, 20s. But realistically, that's a fairly short time in our lives. Like it's kind of unfair to expect that we're going to kind of have some of the things, that we experienced at that time for the rest of the time that we're alive.
Right. So, in doing your research for this book, which I think is an amazing book, by the way, and I've read it, I highly recommend it to all couples. I bet you had a lot of meaningful conversations with men doing the research. Is there any like one conversation that really stands out to you that you had with a research participant that you think just, I don't know, just made a big impression on you, a big impact on you?
Yeah, well, I mean, just as we were talking before we, started recording, just, anytime people participate in research, we're just so grateful. It's just, we can't do this without participants. So, I mean, all of them, quite frankly, do stand out because we just appreciate so much people's time when they kind of open up to us, especially when we're, breaking down norms. But one of the conversations that stand out to me more than anything was a gentleman that I talked to who was defining sexual desire. And he was kind of in his later 50s, for sure, if not 60. And he was describing moments of expressing sexual desire with his wife. And he kept going back to this example of, going bird watching together. And I kept thinking, I was like,
Hmm.
closer, like, like I'm asking about desire. Like, and I'm like, I think you might
Yes.
be
Uh-huh.
understanding me or going down a different, but as we kept
Oh,
talking,
he thought you might have said birds and bees. So he's talking about birds?
Exactly.
Right.
As he kept going, he was like, no, that's for me, that's desire. Like, it doesn't have to be a sexual act. It doesn't have to be sex specifically. Like, I feel it's not just love, it's this wanting, it's this yearning, it's this deep connection that I have with my partner. And I thought, wow, like, I have never heard a man describe
Yes.
sexual desire in such a relatively, like, what I might have considered like neutral or romantic, but like, it was so outside of the scope of what I previously considered that I was like, oh, I should stop challenging this. I'm like, I got to accept you at your word. Like, you're telling me new information and my assumptions and biases are kind of saying, oh, no, no, you don't understand. And he was like, no, no, you don't understand. So that
Uh-huh.
stands out. I mean, maybe as a more, on the spectrum, more on kind of the end of romance versus sexuality. There was lots of like, sexually charged conversations as well. But that one just really stood out to me as like, oh, okay, this is going to be a different type of conversation. And I need to kind of leave more space, even myself, challenging my own assumptions. And, we're all raised in a society. We all have ideas about men's sexuality. And I was like, okay, I'm bringing them into these interviews just, as a human who lives in our society, who was taught certain things about men too. So that stands out to me as just
Mm.
really, really breaking the mold.
Wow, I'm glad you shared that story because in reading through your book too, I resonated with this idea, this theme that men seek sexuality for it's an emotional yearning, but
Mm,
that kind of bucks the social narrative about sex is always very superficial. It's anyone, anytime. It's about, you know, pursuing women with big boobs. I don't know, I'm making this up, but like the idea is that men's sexual desire is very kind of superficial. But I like that story because it just illustrates how there's a lot of depth to this. But are there
mhm.
any other things that you learn where there's a lot more depth to men's sexual desire than just what the superficial story is?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll say a couple of things to that because, what I want to be clear about is like, I'm not trying to create an entirely new box that's saying not superficial or not visual or not simple or not, pleasurable and it's just emotional. Like, I'm not trying to create a new box. I'm trying to say, like, let's throw out the box and just kind of, give space for all of it. It is
Yes.
completely okay, to want sex as a physical release. It's completely okay to just want to experience sexual pleasure. It's okay if
Yes.
you are turned on, by your partner wearing something a bit sexier that day or what have you, right? Like, all of that's well and okay and healthy. It's just what's not healthy is when we only talk about that part. And what I think is so interesting is like, are we leaving enough space for this emotional connection that is so critical? So, for
I
example,
like that.
yeah, okay, good, good.
It's
So, see, I think what's really interesting is, I would ask men, like, do you always want to have sex with your partner? Like, what is that a true stereotype? And, some people would say things like, well, I mean, I do enjoy sex. I do feel desire for my partner. However, recently we've not been on the same page. We're not connected. So actually, she initiated recently, and I said no because I just couldn't connect with her in that way when we were having this big disagreement about, I can't remember now if it was finance or family or something, but there was something going on with this couple. And he was like, this idea that I would just take any sex available to me because I'm a man is just a little ludicrous. Like, in that moment, it actually wasn't how I felt. I did feel comfortable doing it. It wasn't appealing. I wanted to wait till we felt connected first and then have sex. And I think
Mhm.
one of the things about this emotional connection that's so important is what meaning we make from a man initiating sex. And in this case, I'm talking largely about men and women who are in partnerships.
Yes. Uh-huh.
He is initiating sex. do we as a woman take that as he just wants physical pleasure? He just wants sensations. It has not much to do with me. We may respond in a certain way. We may say, yeah, I
Hmm.
feel like having that kind of sex too. Or we may say, actually, that's not feeling so good for me right now.
Hmm.
Whereas if we leave space for sex being a bid for emotional connection, which a lot of men in my research explained to me that that is what it was for them, I
Hmm.
feel close to you. I want to feel connected. I feel safe with you in this way. It makes me feel like our intimate connection is enhanced and deepened when we connect in this way. If you were to kind of accept that, I mean, if we're meant to express that, I would encourage, but also, if for women responding, your response may be different if we leave space for that being the case. Oh, like you're trying to connect with me. Maybe that feels nice and we're more open to having sex, perhaps. Or even if you're not open to having sex, because we should never be having sex we don't want, you might say, oh, I don't feel like having sex, but instead of kind of rolling my eyes or kind of giving the brush off, maybe it's like, but do you want to cuddle for a bit? Do you want to make out? Or maybe not right now, but I would like to connect with you later. Do you want to try in a different way? Like, it's just the idea of like, how do we respond? And what are we getting from a relationship if we accept it as a bid for connection versus how does it feel if we kind of just think, ugh, leave me alone. Like, you just want sex. You don't want me. Like those feelings and reactions are going to be very different and have a very different ripple effect on a relationship.
Yes, I like that very much. So, which brings up another question. In your clinical practice and your research and whatever, what have you found through your experience? Do men generally have more sexual desire than women? Is it about equal? Like
Hmm.
what what do you see?
I mean, it's a great question. So, I'll just pull back and say that socially speaking, and we kind of use broad strokes, we do typically say things like, not just that men have high desire, but men have higher desire than women, right? That is kind of how we frame it. It's like this.
Yes, it's always relative to the other. Yes, uh-huh.
Exactly. So it's interesting because so we talk about it like that, but I'll speak from the research and then I'll jump into the clinical practice. But from the research, we find that when we look at, men and women who are in partnered relationships,
Mhm.
other than these broad strokes, that men and women are equally likely to be the partner with higher or low sexual desire. So basically what I'm saying is, there's a study that I did with a colleague where it was about a third of the participants, the man said he had higher desire. About a third
Uh-huh.
of the time, the woman said she had higher desire. And about a third of the time, they were kind of pretty equally matched. And this has
Right.
been replicated in other studies where about half of women report being higher desire than their male partner. Like this has been replicated. So it's so interesting that we have this idea, right, socially, that men have higher desire than women relatively, as you were saying. But when it comes down to couple by couple, you can have any variation of those. So you can have the woman
Uh-huh.
who's more interested in sex and the man who has lower interest in sex. And that's happening in a lot of couples. In my personal clinical practice, I work with a lot of those couples. Since writing my book, I think they maybe find me a little more often.
Yes, uh-huh.
Sort of talk, right? So it's
Uh,
really interesting because as soon as we go against the grain, as soon as we kind of find ourselves in a situation where we're not in the stereotypical norm, so to speak, it brings up a lot of concerns and worries, right? Like men sometimes think, what's wrong with me? Like I'm supposed to want sex. I'm supposed to have higher desire. This feels uncomfortable. And from my experience, women sometimes take it personally as well. I'm supposed to be
mhm.
wanted. I'm supposed to be desired. I'm supposed to be chased. Like that's kind of the narrative that I was taught. And if I have a partner who's
Right.
a man who isn't as interested in sex as I am or isn't initiating, is it about me? Like, is he not attracted to me anymore? Is there something wrong with our relationship? Is he, I mean, in some cases, questioning sexuality? Is he actually interested in women at all? Like, pretty big questions to be asking when it could just be completely normal variation where just a higher
Uh-huh.
desired woman partnered with a, less or lower desiring man. So it's interesting because
Yeah.
it's actually very, very common. And yet I still find because it goes against what we think it's supposed to be, it can still be kind of challenging and distressing for couples.
So how do you help an individual, like, break through this idea of what is supposed to be, and I'm not fitting in that supposed to be box? How do you help them like realize that what they have is what they have, and that's okay. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to fit some social norm or upbringing or some worldview that they have about how things are supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, great question. And obviously, you said you work with, you helping people individually too. I mean, podcasts, we kind of speak to the broader audience, but when you have one-on-one conversations, there's always going to be specific things that kind of show up. But generally speaking, I do some of like kind of the conversation that we're having, like psychoeducation, right? Like just
Mhm.
acknowledging there are norms and asking, did you grow up in a family that enforced that? Or, just kind of let's speak about how that's reinforced on a social level in movies and music and all these kind of things. And then work to gently challenge them. Like, what would it look like? I mean, are you ultimately, if I'm talking to the woman, for example, are you concerned that your partner isn't as attracted to you anymore? If he doesn't want to have sex as often as you do, or you're concerned that his desire is a bit lower, are there other ways that he can express his desire for you or his attraction to you outside of initiating sex? Maybe it's just offering a few more compliments and saying, yeah, you look really beautiful today. Or, even if I don't feel like having sex right now, like you look really great. Or just so you know, like I'm really attracted to you. I just feel really tired. I'm not in the mood for sex now. But just kind of, can we communicate that verbally? Um, for men, sometimes, because one of the things that I thought was interesting in my research is men sometimes their actions didn't always meet their feelings. So sometimes they would
Right.
initiating sex that they didn't really truly desire because they kind of felt that was their role and what they were supposed to do. There was kind of
Uh-huh.
this, yeah, you're waving your hand.
Guilty.
So it's interesting because that's the thing. It's actually, I would say, a lot of pressure on shoulders to say, I have to do, like, this is my job to always be the initiator. But like, what if I want you to initiate sex with me? Or like, is, anyways, there's a few things we could probably unpack there. Um, just kind of for men being a little truer to themselves too and saying, what would it be like to only initiate sex if you really wanted it? What does it feel like to have sex if you're initiating and you don't really want it? Is that as satisfying? Is it worth it? Maybe there's pros and cons depending on the situation. But for some men, and this is kind of the other side of the initiation piece, is they may feel like, well, what if I'm kind of functioning in this sort of neutral way? I, got to pick the kids up here. There's these bills that need to get paid. We got to get groceries. The dog needs to be walked. Maybe I'm not thinking about sex and it's like kind of jumping out of my body, sexual urge. But if we kind of challenge some of those social norms and my, woman partner starts touching me in a nice way or suggesting like, oh, we should carve out some time for just us tonight or puts on something kind of, sexy, then it's like, oh, well, now that you've put that idea out, actually, I am finding myself kind of responding. And this
Mhm.
idea of being the person who's desired, the person who, isn't initiating, but, has their partner initiating sex with them was a huge factor that came up in my research that men were saying, I love it. Like, but also I'm not getting nearly enough of it because we're
Yes.
raised for men to be the pursuer and we're raised for women to be pursued. And so sometimes, and I'd say actually a lot of times, or at least from what I've seen a lot of times, it can be kind of difficult. Some women feel like they haven't really been given the space to express their sexuality or to pursue men. Like that's not something that they were taught was ladylike, quote unquote, or they just were kind of told to repress or suppress their sexuality. So the idea of kind of leaning into that and saying, I feel like having sex, putting it out there, initiating can be uncomfortable for some women. And so fair enough. I mean, I think we can normalize that's okay if you feel that way, but also I think really empowering to step into that if you can kind of work through some of those stereotypes and say, wait a second, what if I didn't function under those like outdated stereotypes or limiting stereotypes at least? And for
Uh-huh.
and kind of saying, what's it like for me to feel desired, to feel wanted in return, to get the chance to kind of be pursued and say, oh, well, actually, with all this really nice attention, sex is actually feeling like maybe a really fun idea now that you've put it on the table instead of it being my job.
Mhm. Yeah, amen to men wanting to be pursued once in a while. Feels really good. I
Yeah.
think we all wanna be desired, right?
Right?
But what
Yeah.
you're talking about reminds me of my grandparents' generation where,
Mhm.
like, my grandmother really liked my grandfather, but it was against social norms for her to call or to
Yeah.
make the move, right? She had to wait around until he would make the
Oh
call.
my
Like, he's
gosh.
the one asking her out. She can't ask him out. I also love in your book, you talk about this couple. I think it was just a really short one sentence, but it meant a lot to me how the couple kind of just matured around it a bit and said,
Mm,
realize these are the social norms that we kind of grew up with. These are the lenses we're seeing the world, but we don't have to do it. We can create our own.
yeah.
What is it for us, for you and me? And we'll make that our normal. We don't have to compare us and our relationship and our dynamic to the cultural norm or whatever you want to call it.
Exactly.
We can create our own, and that's good for us.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's so interesting because what's so freeing about this, and I think what's so great about some of the findings from this research and just the conversation we're having today is, as soon as you tell me that story of your grandparent, I think you can immediately hear it. And I imagine some of the listeners can hear it and be like, that's like, as soon as you say it out loud, all of a sudden you can be like, that doesn't sound right. Like we should be able to do it differently than that. But I think you need to be aware of
Uh-huh.
like, what is it that we've learned that is just internalized? So we can start
Mhm.
saying, does that fit for me or not? If it fits and it works for your relationship, great. But if it doesn't, which I'm finding just it's more and more, a lot of people are saying, well, it'd be nice to kind of shift it, like you said, even just sometimes, or maybe there's
Uh-huh.
shifts that some, people want to make in their relationships. But I think as soon as we kind of name, like, this is what's happening, these are the messages we've been taught, it's kind of funny how you can so quickly say, like, no way, like, let's toss that one out. Like, why do we even believe that? Like, your poor grandma just waiting for her phone call. Like, thank goodness Sam's at meeting here, but
Uh-huh.
it's got to take charge too, Sam. Hey, do you want to
Uh,
go with me?
Right.
I think you're cute.
I have a question about testosterone and how that plays a role in men's sexual desire. Does it really give them an edge in sexual desire, or is desire just more complex than just the testosterone hormone?
Yeah. So that's a really great question. And I can speak to it a bit, although I will just say, there are people who, especially like medical doctors and, physicians who can kind of speak to
Mhm.
like the specifics probably a little bit more than I can. But from my research and my understanding, um, testosterone plays a role, right? I don't want to say it doesn't play a role. And, we were talking about, even hormones in those teenage years and early 20s and all of that. But over time, it is found that, again, on average, men's testosterone levels will decrease. And there's, different terms, andropause and all this stuff. But there's just this slow decline. And that decline is typically overlapped with a bit of a decrease in sexual desire as we get older. So there does seem to be a connection. That being said, I work with plenty of people who, are 50 and 60 who still have higher sex drives. And so, you kind of have these like different things that interact. And I guess what I want to kind of move away from is even if your testosterone levels are low, like say you went to a doctor and got tested and they're on the lower side, like maybe that explains a decrease in your sexual desire and maybe that kind of helps normalize or understand things. That's great. But it's not a sexual death sentence, so to speak, right? Like,
Right.
because again, what I really want to talk about is there's so many things that can help us feel, increased desire and arousal. It's not just testosterone and then, black or white kind of thinking around it, right? It's like, are we feeling playful? Are we feeling sensual? Are we feeling like we're being, initiated and feeling desired? And like, are we going on these nice dates? Are we having connection? Are we having meaningful talks? Are we having nice experiences? There are so many things we can pull from if you're looking to increase sexual desire. That I just don't want testosterone to be kind of considered the thing that like makes or breaks whether you have a sex drive or whether you have a satisfying sex life. So yes, it plays a role, but it's certainly not the only.
Good. All right. Because there's a lot of talk about, men do it to women all the time. They say, like, if their wife has really low sexual desire, that they say, "Oh, go get her hormones checked." And so it's going the other way now. Like his sexual desire drops, go get his hormones checked. So there might be a physical component, but I'm glad to know there's so much more related to sexual desire than just, your testosterone levels or whatever.
Yeah. And I mean, to that point though, seeing a medical doctor and, figuring out those things, like if you find your low sexual desire or your partner's sexual desire concerning, right? Or if it happened suddenly, or you're just trying to make sense. Like I'm a huge fan of telling my clients, like, go, let's do this holistically. Like if there's someone else who can offer an insight into the medical side of things, it's worth knowing the answer to that. Because there are side effects from various, medications. Low sexual desire could be a side effect from being on certain, antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication. it's worth knowing, is that kind of happening here? If there is cancer or thyroid exhaustion, fatigue, like those things can have an impact on sexual desire in addition to testosterone. But, it's always a good idea if you're concerned to maybe go talk to a doctor and just kind of rule out some of those other factors. But separate from that, yes, I mean, I'm into what's happening relationally and what's happening mentally and what's happening on a social level. So that's where I kind of like digging in to make sure that we're not missing those things because they're hugely important.
Yes, they are important. And you mentioned socially too. So, like, how about upbringing? How does upbringing affect sexual desire in men? Like, is there a difference in sexual desire between men who grew up in homes where sex was talked about and normalized in healthy ways and whatever, versus homes where they didn't talk about sex? Or you were bad or sinful for having sexual thoughts or desires, or men are always pigs out of control, and therefore you need to control your sexual desire. And how does that manifest in the relationship?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The first place my thoughts went to when you asked that question is I've had so many more conversations about messages that women receive about navigating relationships with men, which are men are pigs, they're only out for one thing. And like women are the ones who have internalized that in some cases. I spent a lot of time working through that with women. The message I would say for men is less, well, it kind of be the absence of communication in terms of space to be emotional, right? Like space to say, I want to connect in a certain way. Like we kind of talk about for some men, if you haven't been socialized to say, it's okay to talk about my feelings with my friends. It's okay to cry. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to not know what to do or not have the answer. Like if we're raised in an environment where that's the case, then I think that emotional intelligence like finds its way into a relationship in a healthier way. But if we're not giving that space to young boys, and then they continue as they get into the school system and all of that, and it's kind of reinforced about like, the cool guy has lots of sexual partners or has sex soon, or at least if they, if for them sex before marriage isn't, something that they believe in, there's at least this kind of like, but I want to, or I'm excited about it. Or there's kind of like sometimes this idea of like, how does it show up in a way that like, fitting within our values. But there's still this idea that, sex is celebrated and kind of the only outlet for some of these emotional connections. So I think that unfortunately kind of shows up in an unhealthy way in relationships instead of being able to kind of bring all these parts of ourselves, like everything kind of gets tunneled into physical touch. And physical touch is important, but we also want to make sure that we're connecting in all of these other ways as well. So I think it's right now kind of the absence of talking to men about sex, right? It's like these assumptions of like, okay, you'll just know what to do or you'll be skilled when the time comes and all of this without actually really having meaningful talks about what does that actually look like.
Mm-hmm. And you have children, at least one son I know of your own.
I do.
They're still young right now, but what were you going to do different with your own children than your own experience growing up in your own home?
Oh, that's
around discussions of sexuality.
Yeah. It's like, big question. We're always navigating.
It's a personal question, but I think it's important.
Yeah, my kids are younger, so they're 5 and 7. So our conversations around sex right now are more about bodies and accurately naming body parts and, consent and boundaries and kind of understanding ourselves. The biggest thing I would say is also just not the shaming aspect, right? Like sex doesn't have to be something that, you can't talk about it or it's a dirty word. I mean, in my profession, it's pretty hard to hide the word sex around my family. It's not like we're talking about it over the dinner table, but, in my office, I've got all these books and, there's things that they're like, sex. I'm like, okay. But I think it's about, if my body's responding. So, young boys are going to have erections and not really understand what that means or what that looks like. I mean, we just say, your body's just responding, but, you keep that to your bedroom or to the bathroom. That's still private, but not, shame on you or you shouldn't do that or, things like that just kind of make sex feel like, we shouldn't be talking about it or asking questions about it or this is dirty or bad. Like anything that kind of makes sex fall in that category, I think just as a detriment. Known as. So saying your body's just having a response. And if you want to go to your room and kind of have some private time, like that's kind of your business at this point. But just kind of normalizing privacy, consent, boundaries, but also trying as much as possible to avoid anything that would be in the language of shaming. And then because I keep going to this emotional part, I mean, it's making sure, if my daughter's allowed crying, like I would never in a million years say to my son, man up or don't cry, right? His emotions are just as valuable and important. So it's also just making sure that there's space for him to be able to express himself in the full way that all humans should be able to express themselves as far as I'm concerned.
Very good. I love this conversation. This is fantastic.
Look great.
All right. So Sarah, as we conclude, I want to hear what your black belt sex tips are. Maybe 1 or 2 tips. So let's say you're a couple, you've had these conversations, you've recognized, the way we experience and our sexual desire in our relationship is the way we are going to do it. We're good with this. They work through these issues and now they're ready to take their sex life to the next level. What's 1 or 2 tips you can offer a couple?
I think my biggest thing, especially, as a therapist, is don't assume, like really ask and talk and share. And just because, being in a longer term relationship, just because we tried something earlier on, maybe it doesn't work for us. Maybe as our bodies change or our lives change, we want to kind of switch things up. So what I mean by that is, I work with a lot of people who would have a hard time telling their partner, for example, that there's a certain sexual position that they used to really like doing that no longer is working. Or, they may have perhaps even faked having an orgasm or something along those lines earlier on. And now they don't know how to kind of break out of that pattern or habit because they don't want to
Because they've
offend.
been so busy managing their feelings, another person's feelings.
Exactly.
Right. Uh-huh.
Exactly. And so to me, like just communication. But it's just this idea, like our sexual pleasure, I think is so important. And feeling open to describing that and being open to asking our partner, like, is this working for you? Or I know we've been kind of, it's been a few years since we've maybe even talked about our sex life. Like what's your favorite part or what's the best memory you have of our sex together? What was going on at that time? Like that's one of my favorite questions to ask clients is tell me about one of the best times that you've had sex. And, the things that we can learn from that, like, we were on vacation. Okay, so you're feeling relaxed. How do we pull that into our, experiences again? Because we can't feel as relaxed on vacation, but are there ways that we can kind of take advantage of feeling a little bit more like, can we light a candle? Or maybe if the kids have a babysitter or, do we feel more relaxed like on weekends versus weekdays? We kind of just carved out this special time for ourselves, or we had a really long, meaningful conversation first. Just really understanding those contextual things. And they can change, leaving space for that. But also just actually while we're being sexually intimate, if there's things that are working, actually, I don't really like the way that your tongue is doing this or your fingers are doing that or the pressure of your body here. Like it can be really hard because we're worried that our partner's going to maybe take it offensively or they're going to feel like defensive about it. And that's the last thing that we want to do in a sexual experience. But I would say more that we can kind of gently, positively reinforce, especially, or at least ask those questions. I think it gives us a better chance of actually increasing our pleasure, ideally, which can also have this positive effect on our desire. We're more likely to want to have sex that's good sex. So if there's any part wanting to kind of increase our desire or help our partner experience more desire, let's make sure the sex that we're having is as good as it can be. And there's no one size fits all for that, right? It's like, people talk about being sexually skilled. They're like, okay, sexually skilled with that partner in that situation, right? It's not like one skill, magically work for every relationship. So I hope I answered your question, but I was like, anything that's in the realm of communicate versus assuming, I think is a huge win for a relationship.
Great. Where can people go to find out more about you and your book and the work that you do?
Yeah, so I've got a website. It's my full name, www.sarahhuntermurray.com. And my book is called Not Always in the Mood, The New Science of Men's Sex and Relationships, which you should be able to find at your local bookstore or at least online. And yeah, I'm on Twitter, but less active these days.
All right. Very good. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was a treat.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode of Get Your Marriage On. And if you did, we would love it if you would take a few seconds to give us a rating on iTunes and to share the show with your friends. They'll thank you for life. Once you've done that, you can head over to getyourmarriageon.com for more resources about today's topic and to download our amazing marriage apps. Now go get your marriage on.